Hey folks, I'm Mark Ryan, this is Super Review, and for a few weeks now I've been listening to this. This is a HarmonicDyne Zeus. It's an open back headphone from the company HarmonicDyne. I think they have one other headphone before this. And what this is, well, it's a $350 open back. And what's maybe a little bit interesting about it is that it has a fairly large dynamic driver that is beryllium coated. And again, beryllium coatings on dynamic drivers seems to be kind of in vogue these days. I don't know that it makes necessarily that big a difference, at least to me. I'm sure as a headphone designer it probably matters, but I don't know. I've been listening to this thing just trying to figure out what does, I don't know. I'm not looking to find out what the beryllium driver necessarily means for me, but I was kind of curious how to position this headphone, right? So $350, right? There's a number of other pretty well-known options out there, right? So for 350 bucks, you could get Sennheiser HD 650, you get the HD 600, you get the Hyphaman Sundara. But those headphones are all kind of basically neutral tunes, and if you're looking for something a little bit more bassy, well, you could get let down by those headphones, frankly. And beryllium drivers, well, I think the reason that people like them is that they tend to do bass well. And so that's kind of what we got here, is a bassy headphone. We'll get into the specifics of the sound, but yeah, this is a live review. If you're watching now and you have any questions about the HarmonicDyne Zeus, please leave a question in the live chat. At the end of the review, I'm just gonna go ahead and go through, talk about the build quality, the sound quality, give it a score, and at the end of the review, for the folks that are here live, we'll have a little conversation, and then I'll get to go eating dinner or something like that. But for now, let's talk about the HarmonicDyne Zeus, which I think people are going to agree, this is a pretty unique looking headphone, right? And I don't know, I gotta say, like, it looks pretty cool, but it does seem to me like a little bit of a mishmash of designs. You've got this fairly ornate pattern here on the cups, which is definitely unique. Then you've got these wood accents on the cups, and these things, this wood is actually wood, at least to the best of my ability to tell. I actually took this headphone apart to try and find out. In fact, these little panels up here, they seem to be actual wood. And then the design of the headband up here just seems, I don't know, to me a little bit out of place. But I don't know, it's a fairly attractive headphone. I'll talk real quickly about the things that you get inside the box of this headphone, which isn't a ton, but you do get this headphone, you get a cable, and you do actually get this large carrying case, which I'm gonna go ahead and have to show you on this camera just to see. Fairly large chunky case. It's actually got key locks on it if you're worried about the security of your HarmonicDyne Zeus. Put that there. So that's basically pretty much all that I got inside the box. I mean, the cable does have a 1/4 inch adapter, pretty typical, but standard 3.5 millimeter there. And then on the ends over here, we'll punch in, it is two 3.5 millimeter connectors that each go into either cup of the headphone. Basically the same cable that you can, it's pretty universal connection. Uses the same cable that my Hyphaman Sundara uses, which actually turns out was a good thing, because this cable, let's pull this into view. This cable has got to be one of the stiffest, most unpleasant cables I've ever had. I don't know if this is kind of coming across. Let me go into this camera angle. Can you tell how stiff? Like, this thing is almost a coat hanger. I actually tried to see if I could get one of my shirts to rest on this thing as a coat hanger, just as a little gimmick for this video. It didn't work out, so it's not actually as stiff as a coat hanger, but it's pretty close. And frankly, I'm just not a big fan of this cable. I did end up using my Hyphaman Sundara cable instead for most listening, although, I don't know, at least it's a nice length. It's about 6 foot versus, you know, some of those 10-foot cables that you'll get with other headphones. Frankly, most of my complaints about this headphone are going to be about the build quality, things like this cable, and then we'll get into a few more details about this. But I guess I will start with the good stuff, is that comfort-wise, this is a very comfortable headphone. Weight-wise, it's pretty, I don't know, I didn't put it on a scale, but it feels about in line with what I would expect. It's not a heavy headphone. On the head, the clamping pressure is pretty modest, and I don't know, it's generally a fairly comfortable headphone. I was able to wear it for hours. I do have a little bit of issue with the headband. It's just because it's kind of like this wide band arch. Only the center of it really touches my head, even though it does have a nice bit of padding here. Really, my head only comes into contact with this portion of it. Now, the bright side is because it's not an especially heavy headphone, I didn't really have big issues with that, but I did have to make sure that my head wasn't resting too heavily on that, and just, you know, playing around with the positioning of it. The ear pads, quite large, as you can probably tell here. They describe them as a nano velvet, which to me just seems to be about the same as your typical micro suede, which is quite nice. Generally, micro suede is, I think, my preferred material for a headphone pad. It's kind of like the right balance between velour, which, you know, I generally like the open feeling that you get from a velour, but I don't like the scratchiness. And with the micro suede, you don't really get that scratchiness. And I also find that micro suede does better at resisting collecting lint, or maybe velour does better at collecting lint, which is to say it collects a lot of lint, and that's why I don't really love velour. But yeah, some minor complaints now about the build quality of this thing. It's just generally, it's kind of a clacky sounding headphone. It's not like super well damped. Just design wise, I feel like it's not that advanced. And there are a few other, you know, minor quibbles with it. So like, there's this outer pattern here that looks pretty ornate, but it's actually kind of sharp to the touch. Like if I were to put my fingers here and pull them down into the edges of this, I feel like I could probably cut my skin if that was my goal. It's not my goal, and I haven't actually cut my skin, just to be clear, but it just feels a little bit cheap on the hands. And then the build material here and the headband is, you know, you've got these metal yokes here. I think this frame here is metal, but then the headband portion here is plastic. And on one of the sides, I've actually already got a little bit of cracking going on here where the screws hold the headband in. Does that show up in the camera? There you go. I mean, this is the sort of thing that I imagine, you know, if you got a headphone like this, HarmonicDyne or whatever retailer you buy it from, I got these from Hi-Fi Go. They're going to take care of you. I'm not too worried about that kind of stuff, but it just kind of goes to show, I think, or maybe some sign of the long-term longevity of this headphone. Any other things to talk about the build? I don't really think so. I mean, the last note that I'll talk about this before we talk about the sound is just drivability. And generally, this is a very easy to drive headphone. So I had this thing hooked up to my amp, my shit stack over here, and I was A/Bing it versus headphones like my Sennheiser HD600s, the HiFiMan Sindaras, even the Fidelio X2s. And I feel like of all the headphones I was listening to, this was the most sensitive. So even more sensitive than the Fidelio X2s, which that's a headphone that's pretty well known as a easy recommendation for portable usage. So I think if you are interested in using an open back headphone on a portable source, the HarmonicDyne Zeus is a pretty good option. So now let's go ahead and talk about the sound of this headphone. And the general sound signature of this, as I alluded to, this is not a neutral sounding headphone. I would describe this as kind of like a warm, bassy, mild V. It's actually a little bit stronger in the mid-range than V might describe, but yeah, I would describe this as kind of like a warm, just a warm, bassy V. And now because it's open back, well, yeah, I guess we can get into that right now. A warm, bassy sound signature might be a concern on a closed back headphone. In fact, there are a lot of closed back bassy headphones that just don't sound that good, and maybe I'm mostly just thinking about consumer stuff like Sony XM3s. These things actually do a pretty decent job with that image separation and layering of the music, which is kind of what you would expect out of an open back, and I don't think that the bassy character of this necessarily comes at the expense of that. But let's go and talk a little bit more about that bassy character of the Zeus. So generally I would describe the bass as more mid-bass focused than sub-bass, although I would say that, you know, in head-to-head comparison with the Sennheisers that I mentioned, I find that this does sub-bass certainly significantly stronger than the HD600 and HD650, but really it is that mid-bass that just gives it that overall warm character to the sound. It does, you could say it bleeds into the mid-range for sure. The lower mid-range does have a fair bit of emphasis, and because of that, I would say that the mid-range on this is fairly relaxed sounding. It's not an especially forward mid-range, but it's also not like a recessed mid-range that you might get on something like AirPods Max. I would say that the tuning here, the thing that honestly seemed the most related, and maybe this is a reference that folks watching this video will know, this to me kind of reminds me of the Blonde BL03 in terms of sound signature. Now that's an IEM. Obviously there are a lot of ways in which that IEM sounds different than the HarmonicDyne Zeus, but just in terms of overall tonality, where it's got like this bassy fullness to it, that's kind of how I would describe the general tune of this headphone. I would say the bass, like I said, it does, you know, bleed a little bit into the mid-range, not just in terms of emphasizing the lower mid-range, but the lower mid-range just isn't super transparent as it can be on some other headphones with less mid-bass. So, you know, you could describe it as a little bit on the bloated side, but personally I generally found it actually pretty pleasant. It wasn't necessarily the tightest bass, maybe a little bit on the slow side, but generally I quite liked it. The mid-range, like I mentioned, it's warm. You got that lower mid-range emphasis, but the upper mid-range doesn't have like a great recess to it. Generally, I think a pretty good balance, and it's a very pleasant sounding headphone. Again, this is not neutral. It's quite far from neutral, but for the most part, pretty pleasant through the mid-range. You know, good layering, good textures and vocals, decent amount of openness. Yeah, and then the treble, I think, is probably the part that is maybe the biggest thing to be concerned about. It's a little bit elevated, especially in sort of the lower treble region, sort of in like that presence region. So it can give vocals, like the top end of vocals, a little bit of heat. It can result in a little bit of, you know, sibilance depending on the track that you're listening to, but not especially bad. It just kind of gives the treble, frankly, a little bit of bite, and it's, to some degree, it's pretty welcome given the fact that the rest of the sound signature is so warm. But that, you know, that little treble bite, in my experience, did actually have me listening to this headphone at slightly lower volumes than I typically listen to, just because, I don't know, you could say maybe a little bit on the fatiguing side, but I just found that more comfortable to listen to in sort of a relaxed mode. And, you know, part of it was that treble bite, and part of it, frankly, was just the relaxed nature of that mid-range. Any other notes to talk about that stuff? I can't really think too much. I mean, just again to reiterate that treble, it can be a little bit on the raspy side, I suppose, is another way of putting it. Generally fairly well detailed, not super super sharp in terms of definition, but it's pretty solid. And generally, I think this just kind of, you know, I would say technically speaking, it's fairly run-of-the-mill open back headphone. Again, I think the reason to pick a headphone like the HarmonicDyne Zeus is if this is a tonality that you're after. If you're looking for an open back headphone and you don't want a boring neutral headphone, I put boring in quotes because I like neutral headphones, but if you don't want a boring neutral headphone, I think, you know, the tone of this is pretty solid alternative. Now, a couple of comparisons, direct comparisons, which I made. So I did mention the Fidelio X2, which is another open back headphone that is on the bassy side, definitely known for being bassy. But in head-to-head comparisons, they're actually pretty different. So I would say that the bass on the Fidelios is a little bit more focused to the sub bass. Not that it necessarily has more sub bass presence than the HarmonicDyne Zeus. It's just that the Fidelios are less mid-bassy, and there's less of that lower mid-range bloom. And then I think that's going to be another real big difference between this and the X2, is that the X2 really is just kind of a classic V-shaped sound signature. You've got a fair amount of treble emphasis, you got a fair amount of bass emphasis, and the mid-range just kind of sinks into the background on that headphone. Whereas here with the HarmonicDyne Zeus, I found that the mid-range, because of that lower mid-range emphasis, and the upper mids don't really have any significant recess to them, it just gives it, I think, a fuller, slightly more forward mid-range than something like the X2s. And then the other comparison I was going to make, I've already talked about it a little bit, is the HarmonicDyne Zeus versus the Sennheiser HD 600s. The 600s are basically my favorite headphone in this price range. And just a spoiler, like the HarmonicDyne Zeus, in my opinion, is not unseating them, but this is basically an alternative to something like the 600s. The 600s are just, you know, that's a neutral sound signature, a little bit more mid-forward than this, especially in the upper mid-range. Bass is definitely lighter on the Sennheisers versus the Zeus. You're going to get a lot more, certainly a lot more mid-bass, and I think even better extension in the sub-bass here in the Zeus than you will on something like the Sennheisers. Other differences, I mean, treble on the Sennheisers, in my opinion, is just not a problem at all. It's very, very smooth, detailed, controlled treble, whereas again here, it can be a little bit on the hot side, but generally pretty pleasant. I think just apart from the tonality differences, a big difference for me between the Zeus and the HD 600s, for lack of a better word, is control. I feel like the Sennheisers are just more controlled. It's easier to, you know, the stereo imaging, it's easier to sort of pinpoint things, whereas while this thing does a pretty good job at layering and a decent soundstage, the position, the directional and the position in space isn't as defined here on the HarmonicDyne Zeus. So that, folks, I think is going to wrap up my review of the HarmonicDyne Zeus. I tried to cover everything that was on my mind, but of course, if there's anything I didn't cover, please hit me up in the live chat. Out of 5 stars, I'm going to go ahead and give the HarmonicDyne Zeus a very solid 3 stars. I find this to be a very pleasant headphone. Again, sound signature, tonality-wise, not my first choice, but I've already got my first choice, and this is a pretty nice alternative, and I know not everybody wants a neutral sound signature, so having a decent sounding, bassy, kind of warm, laid back alternative, that's pretty nice. I would say my biggest complaints with this, honestly, are more to do with the build quality than the sound signature. It's a decent build, it's a nice looking headphone, just got a few rough edges that, I don't know, for 350 bucks, you kind of hope are a little bit nicer. But that is the HarmonicDyne Zeus if you're interested in checking this thing out. Of course, I got a link in the description down below, and while you're down there, if you're down there, go ahead and hit the like button for this video if you found it helpful. Subscribe to the channel, ding the bell, and if you're not already here part of the live stream, that bell will let you be part of the next live stream, and then I'll see you on the next super review.